It started with the sign in the yard. That's the part people forget. Before any of it, before the name became a thing you'd flinch at, before it was a movie poster in a Halloween costume and the answer to a trivia question, there was just a wooden sign staked into the front lawn, and it said, High Hopes. That's all. High Hopes. The family had put it up themselves, the way people did back then out on Long Island, naming the house like it was a little boat they were proud of. And there was a statue, too, the Virgin Mary, set near the front of the property, facing out toward the water. I keep coming back to those two things, and I can't fully tell you why. Maybe because they're so ordinary. Maybe because they aren't ordinary at all, once you know what came after. A family that names its house High Hopes and puts the Mother of God in the yard is a family that's planning to stay. That's a hopeful thing to do. That's the thing you do when you think the worst is behind you. Before I get too deep into it, and I'm telling you this early, because once this story gets going, I always lose the thread of everything else. If this is the kind of thing that gets its hooks in you, the unsolved kind, the kind that never really closes, no matter how many people pick at it, there's a collection I keep going back to called The Hollow Files. 10 cold cases. 85 years of disappearances, deaths, and unexplained events across the Appalachian Mountains. The link is down in the description. Now, back to the house. So, the house. It was on the South Shore in a town called Amityville, which is a real place. You can drive there today. People live there. It has a post office and a train station and kids on bikes. It's the kind of town that wants very badly to be quiet, and mostly is. The house sat at number 112 Ocean Avenue, a big Dutch colonial, 3 stories if you count the way that gambrel roof comes sweeping down, and it had a pool and a boathouse and that bit of water behind it. And up near the top, under the roofline, it had these 2 narrow windows set close together, sort of staring out over the lawn. Okay, I'll get to the windows. People always want to get to the windows first, and I think that's a mistake, because the windows are the part somebody decided meant something later. The windows came at the end. We'll get there. Be patient with me. The family was named DeFeo. The father was Ronald, the mother was Louise, and I want to say they were both around 43. He sold cars. Did well at it. Did well enough for the pool and the boat and a house with a name on the lawn. He had a reputation, from what I've read, for being a big man, a strict man, a loud man, the kind of father whose mood the whole house ran on. The mother kept the home. They were Catholic, the serious kind, the kind the neighbors later described as a nice family, a normal family, a close family. That phrase you hear so many times in these stories that it stops meaning anything at all. Somebody mentioned a prayer huddle on Sunday mornings, all of them together. There were 5 children. The oldest was a son, also named Ronald, but everybody called him Butch, and he was 23 the year it happened. After him came 4 more. I'm not going to spend more time on them than the story strictly needs, but the record is the record, and you can't tell this honestly and leave it out. The oldest of the 4 was a daughter, 18, and the 3 after her were all children, the youngest only 9 years old. That's just true. I wish it weren't part of it. It is. Now Butch, the oldest son, Butch is where the trouble in that family seems to have lived, if you believe the people who knew them, and I think mostly you can. He had a job. His father had set him up with work, given him money, given him a car, given him more freedom than most young men his age had. And it wasn't enough, or it didn't take, or something in him just didn't sit right. He drank. He got into fights, and then apologized the next day, and then got into more fights. One of his friends described it later, that whole crowd of them drinking and fighting and saying sorry in the morning, the kind of young men a small town keeps an eye on. There's a story that not long before it all happened, he snapped a pool cue in half in a bar, just out of anger, just because. And there's a much darker story from before, where during some argument between his parents, he supposedly went and got a shotgun and pointed it at his father, and the thing didn't fire. And somehow that got smoothed over, the way things in families like that get smoothed over. Because what's the alternative? You don't call the police on your own son. So there was history there. There were warnings if anyone had been reading them as warnings, which nobody ever does until afterward. And here's where the story properly starts, because the first thing the world ever knew about any of it wasn't the house. It was a bar. There was a neighborhood place near there, Henry's, the kind of bar where everybody knows everybody. And on the evening of the 13th of November, 1974, it would have been dark already. That early November dark that comes down like a lid in the afternoon. Butch DeFeo came through the door of that bar in a state, loud, frightened, the whole room turning to look at him. And he's saying something close to, "You've got to help me. I think my mother and father have been shot," something like that. And a handful of the men in the bar did what men in a bar do. They got up and they went with him, because the house was close, just a little ways up the avenue, and what else are you going to do? They walked over together to 112 Ocean Avenue, and inside it was true. His parents were dead, in their bed. One of the group, a friend of Butch's, Joe, I think the last name was Yeswit, Joe Yeswit. He was the one who got to a phone and called it in. And when the Suffolk County Police came and went through that house, room by room by room, it wasn't only the parents. It was all of them. 6 in total, every one of them in their own bed. And that is the detail that caught in everyone's throat from the very first hour. Long before any book or any movie or any of the rest of it. They were all in their beds, lying face down, every single one of them, as if not one of them had so much as moved, as if not one of them had woken up at all. You have to understand what kind of weapon this was because it matters. It matters more than almost anything else in the whole case. It was a rifle, a Marlin, .35 caliber. That is not a quiet thing. That is not some little pop you might sleep through and tell yourself was a car backfiring. That is a sound that fills a house, that rattles the windows that the neighbors 2 doors down ought to hear in the dead of a still November night. And it was fired. The count came out to around 8 times, somewhere in that range, over a stretch of time in the very early hours of the morning. The medical examiner put the deaths at around 3 in the morning, and not one of them appears to have run. Not one of them got up to see what the first terrible sound was. The houses on that street are close together. The windows would have been shut against the cold, but the sound would have carried anyway. And nobody, not a single neighbor, reported hearing one thing that night. There's a detail that floats around, that the family dog, which was in the house, never raised any alarm either, and I'll be honest with you, I no longer know which version of that detail is real, and which got stitched on later by people who needed the story to be stranger. That's the whole curse of this case. After a certain point, you cannot trust your own memory of which thing you read in an actual police document and which thing you read in some paperback that was trying to sell you a ghost. But the beds are real. That's in the actual record. Found in their beds, face down, lying as though they were still asleep. And I think that's the thing that genuinely got under the skin of the real detectives, the actual men who walked through that house in the dark that night, before any priest or any author was anywhere near it. How? How do you do that? How does a house full of people stay asleep through that? Butch's first story was that it was the mob, that his father had enemies, that it was a hit, a professional thing, somebody with a grudge against a man who sold cars and handled cash. And at first, the way he told it, I think it almost held, because it was the kind of explanation that closed the door on any further questions. A hit, done by professionals. Nothing more to ask. But it came apart fast, the way these things do. The details didn't line up. The timeline didn't line up. The way he'd supposedly discovered them didn't line up with how a person actually behaves. And by the very next day, he had confessed. He'd done it himself, alone, the whole thing. There's a line that gets attributed to him about it, where he said something to the effect that once he'd started, he just couldn't stop. I'm paraphrasing, deliberately, because I don't want to put exact words in a dead man's mouth that I'm not certain of, but that was the shape of it. Once it started, it didn't stop until it was finished. And they found the rifle, by the way, which is the part of all this that's as solid gets. He told them where it was, in the water out behind the house, the canal where the boat would have been tied up. He said he'd thrown it in, along with other things, and they pulled it out, and the ballistics matched the fragments taken from the scene. So there was never any real question of who did it. He did it. Whatever else is murky in this story, and almost everything else is murky, that part is not. He did it. He went to trial the following autumn, October of 1975, and his lawyer, and I want you to hold on to this name, William Weber, because he comes back in a way that ends up being almost the secret center of the entire thing. His lawyer argued insanity, argued that Butch had heard voices, that something in that house had been telling him to do it, whispering to him, that he wasn't in his right mind and couldn't be held to account. The state's people pushed back hard. They said he knew exactly what he was doing. They acknowledged the drugs, the heroin, the temper, the difficult young man, and the difficult father. But they said none of that made him a man who didn't understand what he'd done. A psychiatrist for the state landed on something like an antisocial personality, not a man hearing demons, just a man without the breaks the rest of us have. And the jury went with the state. They convicted him on all 6 counts, second degree, in November of 75. 6 sentences of 25 years to life, stacked one on top of another, which is the legal system's way of saying, you are never walking out of here. And he never did. He died in prison a few years ago, in 2021, an old man, 69 years old, and across all those decades, he never once gave a version of events that 2 people could agree on. He kept changing it, the voices, the mob. At one point, years and years later, he tried to claim his oldest sister had been involved, that she'd done some of it, and that he had only done the one. There was nothing to support that. Nobody serious gave it any weight. But that was him. all the way to the end. Always one more story. Always a new shape to pour the same horror into. And honestly, if it had ended there, it would just be a terrible, ordinary, unbearable American tragedy. A son, a rifle, a sleeping family, a town that wanted to forget. We have far too many of those. It would be a sad footnote in the history of one Long Island town, and the house would have been sold and lived in, and nobody outside of Amityville would ever have heard the name. It would not be the most famous haunted house on the face of the earth. It's what happened after that. I can't get to sit still in my head. So the house goes up for sale, because of course it does. The family is gone. Butch is in a cell. Somebody has to deal with the property. And it sits. For a while, it just sits there, empty. This big Dutch colonial with the dark water behind it and maybe the sign still in the grass. I genuinely don't know if anyone took the sign down and the town not wanting to look at it. About a year, 13 months, give or take, is what I've seen. And then, near the very end of 1975, in December, a new family buys it, and they buy it cheap. They got it well under what a house like that should have cost, and they knew exactly why. They knew precisely what had happened in those rooms. That was never a secret. It had been in every paper. Their name was Lutz, George and Kathy Lutz. 3 children between them and a dog, and they moved in around the 18th of December. They lasted 28 days. That number gets repeated like a rosary in everything ever written about this house. 28 days. They moved in on the 18th of December and they fled. And that's the word everyone uses. Fled. Not moved out, not relocated, fled. On the 14th of January, 1976, left their things behind in the house, didn't pack a truck, just took what they could carry and went and never spent another night under that roof. And the story they told afterward, the story that became a book, that became a film, that became this whole, I don't even have a clean word for it, this whole machine that's been grinding away for 50 years now. The story was that the house had done things to them. I want to slow down here and be careful because this is the exact point where the ground stops being solid under your feet. Everything up to the Lutzes. You've got police reports and a trial transcript and a ballistics match and a confession. Hard, documented, boring, terrible facts. After the Lutzes, you've got a story. You've got people telling you what they felt in their own home with no one else to corroborate it. And I have decided, after a long time of going back and forth, that the honest thing to do is just tell you what they said and let it stand there without dressing it up. Because the moment I start dressing it up, I'm doing exactly what the books did. They said the house was cold. Wrongly, persistently cold, in a way that didn't answer to logic. Fires roaring in the fireplace, and still this cold that crept in and wouldn't leave. They said there was a smell sometimes, a bad smell with no source. They said there were sounds. A front door they'd find flung open in the morning, or somehow wrenched, hanging wrong, black mold-like marks, swarms of flies in a room in the dead of a Long Island January, where there should not have been a single fly. George Lutz said he kept waking at exactly the same time every night, right around 3 in the morning. And you'll have noticed it too, 3 in the morning. That's the hour the medical examiner had set on the deaths of the family before them. And I cannot tell you whether George knew that detail when he started saying it, or whether he learned it afterward and folded it in. And that, right there, is the kind of thing that makes this case impossible to ever fully settle. Kathy said she felt arms around her in the dark, that something held her, that something pressed against her in the night. There was a small room down in the basement, behind a closet, that hadn't shown up on any of the plans for the house. A little hidden space they painted, or found painted, red, and they called it the Red Room. And the dog wouldn't go near it, would back away from it with its hackles up. They said the children changed, got strange, got difficult. They said one of the children took up with an invisible friend, a thing the child called Jody, and that this Jody was a pig, or had the face of a pig. And George said that one night he looked up at one of those high windows of the house from out in the cold yard, those 2 narrow windows set under the roofline that I told you we'd come back to, and he saw a pair of red eyes looking down at him out of the dark glass. A pig with red eyes, watching him from the top of his own house. And that, more than the cold, more than the flies, more than any of the rest of it, that is the image that became the thing. If you've ever seen the poster for the movie, the whole house is shaped like a face, a leering face, and those 2 top windows are the eyes, lit up, glowing. That came from this, from a man standing in his yard in January saying something had looked back at him. Now I have to be the person who tells you the other half, because if I just left it there, with the cold and the flies and the red eyes in the window, I'd be doing the exact same thing the books did. And that's the one thing I refuse to do with this, the lawyer. William Weber. Butch DeFeo's defense attorney, the one who'd stood up in court and argued the voices, the insanity, the something in the house, and lost. He did not go quietly away after the trial. He had, even before the Lutzes ever ran out of that house, been kicking around the idea of writing a book himself about the murders, about the DeFeo family. He had a title and everything, something with the devil in it. And after the Lutzes fled, they came together, him and the Lutzes. Or he came to them. I've seen it told both ways, and at this point I don't think it matters which. The point is, they sat down together, and by Weber's own account, and I'll tell you, the first time I read this, I felt the floor tilt under me a little. By his own account, he and the Lutzes sat down together over a great deal of wine. Many bottles of wine, that's the phrase he used himself. Many bottles of wine, and between them they built the story, built it, constructed it. And he said, more or less plainly, years later, in a magazine, that he knew the whole thing was a hoax because he had helped manufacture it. He said they had created this horror story over many bottles of wine. His words, near enough. And the specifics he claimed to have handed them, this is the part that really, truly gets me, because they're so small, so human, so cheap. There's a story about a neighbor's cat that used to come up to the DeFeo house at night and look in through one of the windows, and its eyes would catch the light. A cat, at a window, at night. And Weber said, more or less, that's where the demon pig came from. That's the red eyes in the glass. A neighbor's cat became a creature from somewhere else over enough wine. Now, I want to be fair. I want to be careful. I do not actually know whether Weber was telling the truth about lying, if you can follow me through that. Because a man like Weber has plenty of reasons to claim he masterminded a famous story, whether he actually did or not. Taking credit for a hoax is its own kind of fame. But that's what he said, and he said it on the record, and it never went away. And then there's the snow, which is, in its own quiet way, the detail that finished the haunting off for me. Part of the Lutz account involved finding tracks outside the house in the snow, cloven hoof prints, like a pig's or a goat's, leading up toward the window where the eyes had been, tracks in the snow. So somebody, an investigator, a skeptic, one of those patient, unglamorous people who actually go and check things, went back to the weather records for those exact 28 days. And the records showed there hadn't been any snow on the ground during the days the Lutzes said all of this happened. No snow? Which means no tracks, because there was nothing to leave a track in. And it's such a small thing. It's almost embarrassing how small it is. But it's the kind of small thing that, once you tug on it, pulls a thread. And once the thread starts coming out, you find yourself looking at the entire sweater differently. It went to court eventually. Not the murders. Those were long settled. The story went to court. There was a lawsuit, a genuinely messy one, the Lutzes suing some of the people who'd been spreading and shaping versions of the tale, and countersuits flying back the other way, claims of fraud, claims of broken contracts. And just the existence of those contracts already tells you something, doesn't it? It tells you that behind the cold rooms and the flies and the red eyes, this was a business, with paperwork, with money on the table before the book was even printed. And a federal judge who looked the whole thing over, Weinstein, Jack Weinstein was the name, came out and said, in effect, that the book appeared to him to be largely a work of fiction, shaped along the lines the lawyer had suggested. A judge said that, put it in the record, that the most famous true haunting in America looked to a federal judge like fiction with a lawyer's fingerprints on it. The Catholic side of it came apart too, and that's the part I'd have thought would hold longest, because the church has every reason in the world to want a good demon story to stay true. There's a priest in the book who comes to bless the house early on and is supposedly driven off, falls ill, hears a voice telling him to get out. The actual priest he was based on, Pecoraro, I'm fairly sure the name was, the Diocese of Rockville Center handled all of it. Later, under oath in that lawsuit, said the dramatic version simply wasn't what had happened to him, and the diocese itself, some years on, put it in writing that the hauntings were false. The church said no. That still surprises me. And then there are the people who actually lived in the house afterward, which is the part that nobody who loves the legend ever wants to sit with for very long. After the Lutzes ran, somebody else bought 112 Ocean Avenue. A couple, the Cromartys, bought it in 1977 and they lived there. 10 years. A decade in the most haunted house in America. And the man, James Cromarty, said the only strange thing that ever happened to him and his wife in those 10 years was people, tourists, carloads of strangers parking outside, taking pictures, knocking on the door, because of the book and the movie. That was the entire haunting. People who couldn't leave them alone. They had to deal with the legend, not with any ghost. Nothing in the house ever bothered them at all. 10 years, so you'd think that settles it. You really, genuinely would. The lawyer says he made it up. The snow says there were never any tracks. The judge says it's fiction. The priest walks it back, the church walks it back, and the very next family lives there a full decade and experiences nothing but tourists. Case closed, hoax. A grieving town's tragedy turned into a money machine by a couple who got a house cheap and a lawyer who lost a trial and badly needed a win somewhere. That's the rational read, and I think the rational read is almost certainly the correct one, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it isn't. Except the Lutzes never really took it back. And that's the splinter I can't get out, the thing that keeps it from closing all the way for me. George Lutz, right to the end of his life, kept insisting it was real, not just kept telling the story for money, though there was money, and I'm not naive about the money. But there is a difference, I think, between a man who profits off a lie and quietly drops it once the cameras are off, and a man who keeps insisting on it decade after decade, into his old age, when there's nothing left to gain and the entire world has already made up its mind that he's a fraud. George kept saying it. He said, more or less, that the story had stayed alive all those years precisely because it was true, that lies don't last like that. And the two of them, George and Kathy, sat for lie detector tests once, back around 1979, and the report came back that they had answered the questions truthfully. Now, a polygraph isn't worth much. I know that. It never was evidence. It isn't science. It tells you about a person's stress, not about reality. But it's a strange thing to volunteer for if you know full well you're lying through your teeth. It's a strange thing to keep doing for the rest of your life. And the children, the Lutz children, who were small when it all happened, they grew up. They became adults with their own lives, their own jobs, no particular reason to keep their late parents' story limping along. And some of them, grown, have said that parts of it were true. Not all of it. Some of them have openly admitted that things got exaggerated, embellished, that the book blew it up far past whatever the reality had been. But they've also said, as middle-aged people with nothing to sell, that something was wrong in that house during those 28 days. That they weren't simply lying about everything, that something happened to that family that they still can't fully explain, even now. So which is it? I've gone back and forth on this one for, I honestly don't even know how long I've had it rattling around in my head. The cleanest answer, the answer I'd give if you put me on the spot and made me choose, is that the haunting was invented and the murders are the only real horror, and that the murders are more than enough horror for any one house to hold. The lawyer admitted it. The judge said it. The weather flatly contradicts it. The next family lived there for 10 untroubled years. That's the answer. That should be the answer, and I want it to be. But here's the thing I keep snagging on, and it isn't the pig, and it isn't the red eyes, and it isn't any of the famous stuff that ended up on the movie poster. It's the beds. It's the original thing, the police thing, the thing from before any of the rest got bolted onto it. 6 people in a not very large house, on a close street, and a rifle going off over and over in the still hours of the morning, and not one of them woke. Not one rolled over. Not one reached for a light. Not one of them ran, or hid, or fought. They were found exactly as they had slept, face down. The detectives could not account for it. Some of them wondered about drugs, that the family might have been sedated somehow, and I think there was some question raised in the medical findings about a trace of something, a sedative in some of them. But it was never clean. It never closed the question. It just left this gap, this hole, right in the dead center of the only part of the whole story that everyone, skeptic and believer alike, agrees is completely real. How do you sleep through that? And I think, and this is just me talking now, this is not from any document, this is just where my own head goes when I lie awake with it. I think that gap is the actual haunting. Not the cold, not the flies, not the eyes in the glass, that. The single thing the police could never explain about the most thoroughly documented part of the entire case. Long before anyone needed a book to sell or a film to make, there was already one thing sitting in that file that did not make sense. One thing that had absolutely nothing to do with George Lutz or William Weber or many bottles of wine. The silence of that house at 3 a.m. The way a whole family stayed asleep through the end of the world. I've come to think the whole legend grew up around that hole the way scar tissue grows over something the body can't push out. The Lutzes, Weber, the books, the films, the tourists, the eyes in the window. All of that came after, all of that is the scar. But the wound underneath it is just that one real, ordinary, completely unanswerable question. Why didn't they wake up? The house is still there, by the way. People live in it now. They changed the address, actually changed the street number so that the curious can't find 112 Ocean Avenue on a map anymore. Because for years and years, people just would not stop coming, the way they did to the Cromarties. Parking, photographing, knocking, looking up at the roof. And at some point, they took the famous windows out, too, the eye windows. Replaced them with ordinary square ones, so the house wouldn't have that face anymore, as if you could renovate a legend out of a building. As if the shape of 2 windows had ever really been the problem. I drove past it once. I'm not going to make more of that than it deserves, because nothing happened, and I have no interest in being one of those people who comes back from a place like that with a story. Nothing happened. It's a nice house on a nice street near the water, and there were children's bikes in a yard a little ways down the block, and somebody was running a leaf blower, and it was the most ordinary scene in the entire world. I sat in the car for maybe 2 minutes, no more. And the only thing I felt, the only thing, was that I had no business being there. Not fear, nothing like fear, just that I was intruding. That whatever this house is, it stopped being a story a very long time ago and went back to being a place where something genuinely terrible happened to genuinely real people, and that the rest of us, the books and the movies and me sitting there in a parked car looking up at the roof, are all, in our way, feeding on that. That was the whole feeling. Not a ghost, just the plain sense that I was part of the wrong thing. So I left. I didn't take a picture. That felt important at the time, and I still think it was. The man who did it, Butch, is the part I think about the least, which is strange, because he's the only part of the entire story that's completely beyond doubt. He did it. He confessed. He was convicted. He sat in a cell for more than 40 years, and he died there an old man. And he changed his story so many times across those decades that by the end, I don't believe even he could have told you which version he actually believed. The voices, the mob, the sister, the demon. He tried all of them on, one after another, and not one ever quite fit, in exactly the same way that nothing in this whole case has ever quite fit. And maybe that's the only real thing he has in common with the house he left behind. That everyone wanted there to be a reason, a clean one, a voice in the walls, a mob with a grudge, a sister, a demon, anything at all that was bigger and stranger than the truth. And there just wasn't. There was a young man, and a rifle, and a sleeping family, and a question that nobody could answer. And then there were 50 years of people trying to build an answer big enough to fill the hole, and not one of them ever managed it. I said I'd keep this short, and I haven't. I never do with this one. There's just so much of it. And the maddening thing, the thing that keeps me up, is that the more of it there is, the less you actually end up knowing. You'd think all those books would finally add up to something solid. They don't. They just add up to more. The sign. I'll end where I started, with the sign in the yard, because it's the detail I genuinely cannot put down. High hopes. Somebody in that family stood out on that lawn one afternoon, before any of it, and decided those were the words they wanted on the house. Picked them. Hammered the post into the grass. And meant it, probably. That's the part. They meant it. And then everything the name was supposed to keep out came in anyway, in the dark, in the early hours while they slept, and after that the name just sat there in the grass being the 2 saddest words you've ever read, until eventually somebody took it down. I don't know what happened in that house. I want to be honest about that more than I want to be interesting. And I know those 2 things pull against each other. The famous part is, almost certainly, a story built over wine by a lawyer who lost a case and a couple who wanted out from under a mortgage they couldn't carry. The real part is just a crime, an ordinary, unbearable crime, the kind this country has far too many of. But there is that one gap in the middle, that one thing the police wrote down and could not explain. And I have never been able to close it, and somewhere along the way I stopped trying. Some stories don't end, they just go quiet. And you walk away from them and you tell yourself you're done with it, and then a few years later you find yourself driving slowly down a street near the water, not taking any pictures, not getting out of the car, just looking up at the place where the windows used to be,